This is my Kawasaki Ninja 500 SE, and today we're going to be going over why this bike is better than the Ninja 650 in almost every way. I would say I got the keys, let's go ahead and start it up, but this has a key fob, not just your standard key. Fancy. So let's go ahead and start this up and go. So I've actually owned two Ninja 500s. This is my second one. This is the SE. The previous one was just the standard 500 without ABS, you know, the cheap one that you can get. And I gotta say, I've had a blast on both of these bikes. Now, you know, we're going to talk about the 650, and my experience isn't coming from nowhere. I've owned two different 650s. I've owned it in the Z platform and the typical Ninja 650 platform. So I've had a good amount of miles on both 650s and the Ninja 500. So you might be thinking, why is the 500 better than the 650? It's slower, it has less CC, there's less power. Why is the 500 better than the 650? There's no way. And I'm not trying to just knock on 650 owners. If you got a 650, I'm not saying it's a bad bike. I'm saying if I had the option, this is what I would do. So there's a couple reasons why I feel that the 500 is overall just better. And the first thing is going to be the power. Well, what do you mean? The Ninja 650 has more power than the Ninja 500. So wouldn't the 650 be better than the 500? Well, here's the thing, all right? You're not talking a huge power difference between the 650 and the Ninja 500. The Ninja 500 has about 51 horsepower and the Ninja 650 has 67 horsepower. That's not a big difference. I can't do math on the spot right here and pay attention to riding, but it's not a big difference at all. Let's talk about the top speed for a minute, because that's another issue. Another reason why I'm like, you know what? It's really the 650 isn't the better option. So I'm not a huge top speed junkie. I could care less about the top speed of a bike, but a lot of people like to brag about the top speed. You know, their 600 goes 180 miles an hour. No, it doesn't. We all know you're lying, but whatever. I'm not one of them, but I can tell you the Ninja 650 has a higher top end speed by about 15 miles an hour, which is sure, that's a little bit. You get about 115, 120 miles an hour on this bike versus 130, 135 miles an hour on the Ninja 650. So what's the overall difference in riding the Ninja 650 or riding the Ninja 500? And I'll tell you, there's not a big difference overall. So the first time I rode a 500 back a year or so ago, I was dailing my MT-07 currently, and I jumped on the 500. I'm like, dang, there is not a big difference as far as like the feeling of riding it goes. There's not a big difference in power between this and the FZ07, and the FZ07 puts out a little more torque, a little bit more horsepower than that Ninja 650. Now, I was thinking, I'm like, in comparison to the Ninja 650, there is not a big difference whatsoever in power, which is kind of crazy, because what is it? This is a 451cc versus 649, if I remember correctly. You're getting about 200 extra cc for, you know, not much more power. And when we're kind of talking about power and all of that, let's talk about the sound of the engine, because that's another crazy thing. They're both flat planed parallel twins. They sound identical, exactly alike. There is barely any difference. I can never tell, oh, is that a 650? Is that a 500? Is that a 400? It's so hard to tell because they're both parallel twins. They're both flat planed. There's nothing special about them. Now, on the other hand, MT-07, that sounds different. That sounds more aggressive. It sounds like a bigger bike, or the R7, Aprilia 660, GSX-8R. All those bikes have a cross-plane crank, so they sound so much better, so much better. They sound like a bigger, more aggressive sounding bike versus, you know, the 400 Ninja 650 sound is just a small engine lawnmower sounding, which I don't really care, to be honest. Like, whatever you like, whatever floats your boat. But in my opinion, I'm not a huge fan of the sound, especially when you got a freaking straight pipe and a tune and it spits flames like this. I mean, flames are awesome, don't get me wrong, but this bike is loud for being a really small bike. And that brings us into our next talking point, which is the difference in weight between these two bikes. Because yes, it has 200 more cc's. What's the downside? It's always going to be weight. So let's talk about the weight. How many times can I say weight? So the Ninja 500 comes in at about 370 pounds. I'm pretty sure this is the dry weight before all the fluids are added. And then the Ninja 650 comes in at 419 pounds. So you got about a 50 pound difference. Now, again, when your specs aren't that different, when this bike basically does the same speeds as that one does, that is a downside on the Ninja 650's part for sure, because a heavier bike equals, you know, I mean, especially for learning, it's not going to be a good thing if you're not used to the weight of a bike, but mainly just the way light bikes feel. They're so amazing to ride. I always, whenever I don't have a light bike in the inventory, I find myself wanting a 400, a 300, something to rip through all the twisties, because there's just something magical about small displacement bike, ripping them to their full power, not going crazy speeds, ripping them through twisties. I'm always going to pick the lighter option if possible, and with the Ninja 650 versus the 500, again, your specs aren't very different, so why wouldn't you just get the lighter bike? That's kind of how I see it, and some people might argue with that. But again, I just see it as you're paying more money for a little more CC, hardly any power, and a heavier bike. It doesn't make sense to me at all. But that will bring us into another point, which is going to be the price difference. Now, there is a big price difference, especially seeing that, again, the spec sheets aren't looking great for the 650 versus the 500. So if you want to pick up a brand new Ninja 650, MSRP before fees, before taxes is $8,299. Now this Ninja 500, same thing, you want to pick it up before fees, before sales tax, you're looking at $5,299. So you're looking at a $3,000 difference between these bikes, which is absolutely absurd to me. $8,000, okay? At that point, why don't I just buy a ZX4R? It's like barely more expensive for such a unique bike that is so much more fun to ride and actually sounds good. But anyways, a little rabbit trail there. Back on the topic, it's just, I find it very absurd that you would want to pay $3,000 more for a bike that barely goes faster, barely makes more power, sounds the exact same, looks basically the exact same. It just blows my mind. But again, there is people out there that may like that little bit of difference, that, you know, they want to grow into that bike and keep it forever. I get it. But I'm just saying, if you have the choice between the two, why pay more for something that, in my opinion, isn't as good? If you own a Ninja 650, I'm not saying it's an absolute garbage bike, although it kind of is. But, you know, at least you're on two wheels, you're having fun. I'm not saying you're stupid for getting a 650 at all. I'm just saying, if I had the choice between a Ninja 500 and a Ninja 650, these are all points I would want to look at and kind of take into consideration before, you know, making a choice. In my opinion, 500 is always going to be the better pick versus the 650. I'm honestly surprised the 650 is a thing. I'm surprised they haven't, you know, put a cross-plane crank in any of their twins. I think the reason for that is they're trying to keep, you know, their beginner lineup cheap, which it is. $5,000 is a fair price. You're looking at like $7,000 out the door. That's fairly affordable, seeing that it would be a brand new bike. Now you can pick these up used for even cheaper, obviously, but I think Kawasaki is trying to keep them cheap, which kind of just makes the 650 useless at this point. If they put a cross-plane crank in, it made a little bit more horsepower, a little bit more top-end speed, kind of like the R7 does, I think it would be a much better option, and I think more people would buy it, because right now the 650 just seems like a paperweight bike to me. It really does. I think out of all the bikes I've ridden, all the bikes that, you know, I know about and aware about, I think the 650 is one of the most, you know, kind of pointless bikes. Just being, again, it sounds like a 400, it weighs as much as a 650, it costs as much as a 650, but it's really just a bigger 400. So yeah, there you go. That's what I would do personally. 500 over the 650. 500 wins in my opinion. But again, do what you want. Don't let anybody tell you what to do. If you're in love with the 650, if the 650 is your dream bike, send it. You're gonna have fun on that bike. Don't let anybody tell you what bike to buy. I'm just trying to make you think about these things before pulling the trigger on either of these options.